Hi guys, it's Rory here and welcome to the Football Heritage Podcast. Hope you're enjoying everything that our fantastic podcast has to offer so far this year. Firstly, I'm here to tell you that our brand new patron exclusive feed, the Football Heritage Extra, is now live. You can subscribe for £3 per month and that gives you access to an additional exclusive podcast every Thursday. We've designed our patron exclusive content to be a wee bit more casual, more niche and full of exclusive insights and interviews with our friends, contributors and other people working within football. Links to subscribe are in all of our episodes, show notes as always. Looking forward to seeing you over there. Secondly, if you enjoyed last week's show, it would mean the world to us if you could leave a review on Apple and Spotify, or if you're listening on YouTube, a comment and a like. It really helps the algorithm pick us up and does so much for pushing us in front of new listeners every week. Please remember as well to leave a comment on our episodes on whichever platform you're listening on. One of our favourite things is engaging with you guys and being able to speak with you about the conversations that we're having every week. Lastly, please remember to visit our website to read our articles and see what other projects we're working on at the moment. Or if you like, come and join us on our social media for daily posts and content related to the heritage of football across the world. We're always up for a chat, so if you have any questions, suggestions or feedback, feel free to DM us on any of our socials or email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. I think that's about everything that I need to plug at the moment. Thanks once again for listening. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host Rory Bryce and I'm joined this afternoon by Chuck Carlson.
Good afternoon.
It's great to have you on, Chuck. Thanks very much for joining us today. Some of our listeners might already be aware of Chuck. He is a member heavily associated with the Society for American Soccer History, and he also recently wrote an article for us on soccer in Illinois Coalfields. That's going to be the subject of our discussion today. We're going to jump into the history of the minor footballers of Illinois and how soccer developed in and around Illinois, but also in Chicago in those early years, and how it was really spurred on by industry and this thread of industry which stretches all over the world. It's something that we were just talking about off air. Before we kick things off properly, Chuck, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself, first of all?
So I am an archivist by trade. So historic preservation is something I've been interested in a long time. I started playing soccer when I was 4 years old. The first World Cup I remember was the 74 World Cup in West Germany. Got a piece of that. So I've always been interested in the game, love history, love sharing history, worked as a history teacher. So this is the chance to talk about the research I do is a great opportunity.
Yeah, no, it's honestly, it's amazing to have you on. The Society for American Soccer History do great work and actually promoting this idea that yes, America does have a soccer history out with the MLS and what they might like to push. And those are the stories that we like to tell as well. You know, we've had episodes about the early development of soccer in Utah. We've spoken about Fall River Marksmen before and their early influence in the game, Bethlehem Steel, and all these different soccer hotbeds throughout the US who really helped push the development of the game in those regions. Obviously, we're talking a time when it was practically impossible for soccer in the US to develop as an entire United States. You know, this is something that really sprung up in regions and different regions and areas of states. And Illinois is one of those regions. Now, obviously, a lot of people will know about the obvious soccer hotbeds like on the East Coast because that's where a lot of migrants went. And I think these are the things that are important to mention in the discussions that we have. The early development of soccer in the US is as much about football and the sport as it is about migration, industry, and collective action as well. And those are the three things that are really going to feature in our discussion today. And as I said, the more of these little soccer hotbeds we uncover from different places, the more interesting the story becomes, and the more we can start to actually build this different landscape of how early soccer in the US looked. So, let's go to the very beginning, Chuck. Start us off. Tell us about the background, first of all, of industry in Illinois and why mining plays such an important role in the discussion we're having today.
Well, firstly, I just want to touch on what my research is doing.
Sure, yeah,
I think it's important that the history is brought to today, is an essential element in why we study that. I think what soccer does is it allows us to explore broader themes in society, themes of race, themes of class, themes of gender that exist in the US. In the beginning, when soccer is evolving as a game, the rules are written, they're transferred over. Industry in the US is also expanding, and particularly in the Midwest, Chicago is a rapidly growing city. You have the steel industry, you have the meat packing industry, you have all kinds of workers that are required for that. Well, you need fuel for that city, and the fuel came from coal. So literally, you have fields. Coal had been known to be underground in Illinois from the time that Native American communities were there. But it wasn't really exploited until the mid 19th century. So you literally have these fields. Illinois is flat. You can see 4 miles. Underneath that flat land was a ton of coal. And so you'd have a field with nothing, and within a few years, you'd have a community of 5,000 people around the mining tipples. And these tipples would be seen 4 miles because they were the only thing of any substance. So you have these large communities all of a sudden springing up in the Midwest. And so people have some extra time, and extra time then becomes sport. And the sport that was being played around many of these coal mining communities was baseball and soccer. They were the two main activities for people. In the summer, baseball. In the fall, winter, and spring, it was soccer.
I think this is what's so interesting for me is that the development of soccer in the Illinois coalfields and hotbeds of industry is that it's a microcosm of how it happens elsewhere in the world as well. Because, around me, like I was saying off air, living in South Lanarkshire, rural South Lanarkshire, and knowing that, just down the road you have all these mining villages, especially going into Ayrshire, where mining plays such a huge role. You also have what really is the spine of the junior football scene, Scotland's non-league, because when these mining villages cropped up, football teams cropped up. As I've mentioned numerous times before, we also have the village of Glenbuck, where the Shankly family were born. Came from a mining village, and the amazing thing about that mining team is that the village never exceeded in population of 1,500, but they managed to produce somewhere in the region of between 70 and 80 professional footballers and managers, which is an incredible turnover. Some of these guys went on to pioneer the game, as we said. The Shankly family can still go to the remains of their house today. So, industry and specifically mining and football go hand in hand a lot of the time. Going back to how people in Scotland and England, Wales, Ireland, wherever spread the game around the world, this is kind of how it happens as well. Of course, there is influence from the local people who have, worked in these villages and are playing the game, absolutely. But then through industry, you get migration because with different mining companies who operate in both the States and in Scotland and elsewhere, you get people moving over. They bring their version of the game with them. They bring new advanced techniques like passing. And this is how the game develops further and spreads. So really, soccer, migration, and industry in this period, specifically in the Americas, not just the United States, in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, these three things go hand in hand, and it's really how the game develops to the stage of, how it does with the dominant teams of in the early 1900s, and really when the US Open Cup starts becoming a thing.
And as you mentioned, those towns, those communities, many of them provided migrants to towns in Illinois. And once one family comes over, it's amazing to see how many others follow those families. And what is fascinating to me about the Illinois experience is the first generation of particularly Scottish immigrants, which are teaching the passing game. So you have high quality teams in Chicago, but then in the coal mining communities as well, that are competing against these bigger cities, and they're beating them. The teams are primarily made up of Scottish immigrants. But then you also see a second generation, which is American, USA-born soccer players who are super high quality. There's a family called the Tallman family. The father was born in Scotland and emigrated to the Braidwood area, which is the northern tip of the Illinois coal fields. They moved to a tiny town called Carbon Hill, Illinois. And Carbon Hill becomes a soccer powerhouse around this family of Tallman USA-born children. There's 8 of them. And they populate teams in Chicago, in St. Louis. There's some of the top players in the entire country. Now, I'm talking the early 1900s here. So
Yeah, sure.
before there's a real national team opportunity. But that's the depth of quality that exists in these communities. I just want to touch on the international element. In 1909, there's a team of British all-stars called the Pilgrims, who toured in 1905. They came to the United States. They came back in 1909. They're playing on the East Coast. They're playing the big cities. They come to Chicago and play. They play in St. Louis. They actually score over 120 goals. Against USA teams get 15 or 16. I can't remember the exact number. It's pretty small. They compile a record with only one loss and two draws. Those happen to be, they play in the Illinois Coalfields. They play a game against a team called the Coal City Maroons, and they tie 0-0. They play in the Tallman brothers were playing in that game. They played against a team from Gillespie, Illinois, and tied 1-1. So you can see the level of quality that exists in these communities.
And I can imagine similar to other industrial communities as well, with every community, with every mining community, some of it comes back to how the companies operated as well. Different collieries and different mines opened up in different areas, and therefore the towns were built around those. And that's how we got a lot of our town names and the places that exist now, etc. But with each colliery, there was also rivalries because companies were pushing them to have more production than the other ones and things like that. And that's a touch more sinister, but that's a conversation for a different podcast. But also with that, the football teams and the soccer teams then developed rivalries, so that I can imagine in this period in Illinois, it must have been so competitive when these teams played against each other.
Well, that's what's fantastic. The northern Illinois coal mining towns, as I mentioned, Braidwood, Carbon Hill, Coal City, South Wilmington. There's Clark City, Illinois. In 1899, plays a team from Chicago, Pullman, for the championship of Illinois. 11,000 people attend that game in 1899. And this team from Clark City, Illinois, beats Pullman, so is technically crowned the champion of Illinois. Clark City now is nothing but a field. I drive through these communities, and it is amazing. Like, wait, where is Clark City? There's like a little bump, which used to be, where the mine waste went, and that's all that remains of that place. And it is sort of indicative of American history, of American soccer history, that all you see is a field with a little bump, but you dig a little deeper, and there's actually some pretty incredible information in there. So these teams started very local and then started spreading out, and they attract international attention. They attract East Coast attention. Teams from the Midwest go out to Fall River. Bethlehem Steel comes and plays in the Illinois Coalfields, and Bethlehem Steel ends up stealing one of the players from Gillespie, who ends up becoming the coach of Bethlehem Steel and one of their most successful. If this soccer playing hadn't existed in that Illinois area, Bethlehem Steel wouldn't have been as successful as they became.
It's a huge turning point in history, one of those sliding doors moments within football. But it just goes to show that the quality and the depth of quality that exists and was available during this time, and what we would probably consider today as amateur settings, unorganized settings, it was real, and the quality was very real as well. And that's why these clubs are huge within the early landscape of soccer in the US. Bethlehem Steel especially coming to take players from that just really kind of speaks to how good these leagues actually were within Chicago. One thing that I wanted to actually ask Chuck, obviously we're talking about specifically the industrial kind of heartlands within Illinois here. Was this where soccer in Illinois sprung up for the first time? Is this where it started to spread for the first time? Because obviously, you have the Coalfields, but you also have the industry within Chicago itself, and you would have industry elsewhere within the state as well. So I'm curious to know, Is this how soccer started developing within Illinois, or were there other hotbeds within the state occurring in tandem with the development within the coalfields?
Excellent question. Chicago, the first documented game is 1883 between the community of Pullman, which Pullman is now a national park in Chicago. It was the Pullman rail cars were built there, so Pullman is a known community. What's not so known is Pullman had fantastic soccer from the 1880s into the 1930s. Players that end up on the 1934 World Cup team initially came to Pullman to play soccer. So Pullman played a team called the Wanderers in 1883. This is the documented game. But clearly, the game was played, or a similar type of game was played around Chicago before that. In tandem with that, and this brings us to Braidwood, one of the early hotbeds that is also a mining community. Braidwood would compete against Chicago teams and would defeat them very, very often. Part of the reason Braidwood was so good is they were playing also against other coal mining communities, such as Spring Valley, Illinois, and Streator, Illinois. So these other towns that are not nearly as well known now in the 1880s and 1890s had excellent soccer and competitive soccer. So you have this ecosystem of mining communities competing against each other, getting better at the game, going to the larger communities and competing. At the same time, you have industry investing in it. Pullman created an area for their soccer team to play, a soccer specific ground for them to play. So you have industry investing to keep workers occupied in their off time, which, as you sometimes say, it's sometimes sinister, but it also, the workers themselves took advantage of that. And they take advantage to organize their leagues, to their high quality leagues. They organize their competition. So you have that same thing that's happening in the big city of Chicago. It's happening in smaller communities too. And so their teams, Standard, Illinois. There's Thayer, Illinois. There's Kincaid, Illinois. There's DeVernon. I can go on and on. I have 132 towns that had good mining towns that had good soccer teams competing against each other. So you have this ecosystem which is evolving the same way it was evolving in other parts of the world, where local communities gather around a sport, compete in that sport against other communities. Professionals begin to form. So in the coal mining communities in 1921, there is a professional league that is started. And I know that it was an actual professional league because the Gillespie soccer team published their financial statement in the local newspaper, and there's a line for payment to players. Now, it failed, but the effort was there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we can talk about other early soccer leagues in the US that failed. There was the American League of Professional Football or something like that, one of the earliest ones in the East Coast that was quite similar. But the point is that they were trying to be professional at least, and athletes were professional as a result of that because they were being paid to do it.
Yep.
And, just one thing that you mentioned there as well, as was the case elsewhere in the world, workers took ownership of it as well. Obviously, I mentioned that sometimes it can be there is these sinister elements behind it, but workers take ownership of these things very quickly, as we find with other football teams. I mean, if we look to London at Thames Ironwork FC, Arnold Hills, who was within the sort of matrix of owners, he was fairly benevolent, and he at least tried to understand what his workers were going through and put a lot of money into making sure the Thames Ironwork team, who of course would eventually become West Ham, were successful until he got a little bit overwhelmed and then pulled his money. But the point is, though, that a lot of the times, yes, they were works teams, but the works were putting a lot of money into making sure they were successful. And the players who played for them, they were paid very handsomely for the work that they were doing. But on the other side of things, and what is relevant to our story here in the Illinois coalfields, is that social history and trade unionism plays a huge role in the development of the sport.
Well, and that's where Gillespie in particular ends up being a fascinating place to study, because as unions are starting to form, the United Mine Workers of America were sort of the main union. But in Gillespie, there's an alternative union called the Progressive Miners of America that is formed in 1933. And what was unique about the Progressive Miners of America is that they were trying to incorporate women into their union. They had these massive women's auxiliaries, tens of thousands of women helping to support their miner workers. So gender, as you look at the Progressive Miners of America, gender was important. They also are trying to incorporate black miners. The United Mine Workers of America were excluding black workers, and actually trying to discourage black workers from joining the union movement. Progressive Miners of America were incorporating that. And one of the players that I'm talking about, Bigham, was a member of the Progressive Miners of America, had come to St. Louis from Scotland, moved to the mining community, plays for the Gillespie team, but he also started a funeral home because there was basically a cabal making it expensive for people to bury their dead. And he, with the help of the miners' union, makes it much cheaper. But he was also an excellent soccer player. So it's a way to tell a social story with soccer history there too.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And this is the thing that we always find through these conversations is that the social history, particularly in the early years, but also today as well, the social history is often so entwined with how football clubs operate at this period of time, especially spring up, coming out of this era of the public schools in England really having dominance, the gentlemen amateurs really having dominance over football and the rules of football. You really see the works teams and the working class people start to develop soccer in a way that really mirrors their conditions and their lives as well. And this is why it plays an important social role as well. And I think the trade union side of things is very important because obviously over here in the UK in the 70s and 80s, you had miners' strikes football matches, and football as a way to promote protest goes back much further. You had the women playing through bands in Scotland and England.
Yep.
You had people in Glasgow during the rent strikes in the 20s who were playing football to raise money for people who couldn't afford rent. So to me, football and protest is always something that has worked in tandem, and it was the case here in the Coalfields as well, especially where unions were involved, because these unions would also have representative teams who would play against each other.
Yep. And the important point that you make there, I think, is also about opportunities for women to play the game. Yes. And how fundamentally that was denied in the United Kingdom. When it started to become more popular. You can see a similar sort of thing in these Illinois coalfields, that girls, in particular, the local high schools in Gillespie, Illinois, in Taylorville, Illinois, in Joliet, Illinois, are developing girls' soccer teams. And those girls' soccer teams are creating their own tournaments to play against each other. So in the 1920s and 30s, you have girls very interested in athletic competition, and it's being not supported at all. They organize it themselves. But soccer is one of the games that they focus on. And it's really interesting to see the parents, the fathers who played soccer, their daughters then are often the drivers of those soccer teams. As we know, the U.S. women are the most successful international team, and we sort of think, oh, that's from 1970s, Title IX, which helped to fund. But you can look back even further and see that the game of soccer was interesting to Americans well before that period of time.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so many stories that really speak to that for me. I think one of my favourites is one of the major kind of benefactors and family names from Perth is Thomas Dewar, who was a whiskey baron. And I only found this out through speaking with Eliane Corona. We'd done an episode on the US Open Cup with him 2 years ago now. Is that the US Open Cup was originally known as the Dewar's Cup. Yep. And it came from Thomas Dewar. But over here, you'd have no idea that that's who it came from because there's nothing that actually tells you that that's what he done. He donated that trophy because he was a whiskey baron and he had good links to the US, and it's because of those good links to the US that Scottish, I mean, not just Scottish, obviously British influence as well, but for the purpose of this story, Scottish influence plays a huge part in the development of soccer in the US, because you had things like the Jurors Cup, you had the Lipton's Trophy, you had so many players moving specifically from these industrial heartlands in Scotland to different industries in the US, either for better pay, chance at a better life, or because their employers had expanded and were offering them a position there as well. And it's really through this migration that Scottish players then come to Illinois. And you've already mentioned Bigham, but there was also Hendren and Easton, two prominent players who you mentioned in the article as well. But I can imagine there were so many more.
Well, just to highlight one in particular, a guy named Andy Auld, who played in the 1930 World Cup for the U.S. team. Andy Auld came to the United States in the early 1920s, and he comes to Gillespie first. He joins the Gillespie soccer team, and he is not a star on that team. He is one of their regular forward line. But because a team from New Bedford came to play against Gillespie, so New Bedford in Massachusetts, an ASL professional team, he's discovered it playing in the Coalfields. He goes to New Bedford, becomes a professional soccer player, and makes the 1930 World Cup team. There are tons and tons, but Hendren is a fascinating, back to the article a little bit, that I want to point out is why I sort of picked these three individuals. Was Bigham is someone who comes, uses soccer, creates a career, creates a life, has his family. His family is still locally in the area. You have Easton, who also came high quality player. His brother was an excellent player too, is plucked out of the Coalfields of Illinois, goes to Pennsylvania with Bethlehem Steel, makes a career out in Bethlehem, gets involved in other sports, is a promoter of the Harlem Globetrotters in the 1940s. So Easton is an interesting, American immigration story. And then the third is the story that's not often told in the United States, which is the immigrant who comes and then goes back to where they were from. And so Hendren's life unfortunately ends tragically and much too soon. But again, a good player reading the news reports, but not a superstar. But then goes back to Scotland and plays for Hibs for a number of years, and is on the cover of the Hibs history, is in the Cowdenbeath Hall of Fame, but came to this Coalfields, hones his game in a sense, but then goes back to his country of origin. So those three players are sort of why I focused on them for this particular tale. But there are, as you say, there's hundreds of others that have interesting. Now, for example, Bigham's daughter marries a guy named Tom Scott. Tom Scott is a Scottish professional, comes to the U.S. in the 1920s, plays for Chicago Bricklayers, plays for Sparta. Chicago Bricklayers are a fantastic team. They finished second in the Open Cup twice. Were a union team, a union organization, but Tom Scott was the center of that. He marries Bigham's daughter, so the connections. Tom Scott's daughter, I think, is 90 some years old, and she's still working as a travel agent. I've spoken with her a couple of times, and she went and saw her father play in the 1940s and explained there was a soccer-specific stadium in Chicago that Sparta had. Sparta won the U.S. Open Cup. They were the first Chicago team to win the Open Cup. Tom Scott lined up with that team. A guy named Dick Vidano from the Coalfields of Illinois lined up on that Sparta team. So you see high quality but interesting personal lives.
Oh yeah, for sure.
On top of that, and the way like Tom Scott's daughter was able to describe to me what it was like to go into the Sparta Stadium to watch her father play a game. The Sparta Stadium was torn down in 1954, but the soccer community is amazing and huge in the U.S., but it needs to be tapped into. Like she didn't think soccer was anything. She's like, we Americans, we don't care about soccer. Like your father was one of the best players in the country for a number of years.
And this is part of the thing, because we're talking about this off air. Obviously, what S.A.S.H, the Society of American Soccer History, do, very much like our partners in ANSIF, is that they're trying to piece together the history, and especially the early history of soccer in your respective regions. But a lot of people think, and this is half the battle, a lot of people think this information is useless. No one cares about soccer.
Right.
Why would anyone be interested? So it becomes so difficult to actually try and find out these stories because of that.
Yeah, but they exist, and that's where when I go into these former coal mining communities, and do research, and you meet the people. Michelle Mistich from the Carbon Hill Historical Society has done unbelievable. It is a treasure trove of American history, but also American soccer history. This player I mentioned before, Dick Vidano, he's a chemist by trade. But he's also an exceptional archivist, and he collected. I mean, there are boxes and boxes of fantastic American soccer history. He was supposed to play in the 1924 Olympic team, but it was found out that he had been paid. So he was disqualified from being able to participate on the national. But for 30 years, he's one of the top players in the Chicago area. But at the same time, he was a great archivist. And so he saved all kinds of material. And now, like Michelle Mistich of the Carbon Hill Museum, Carbon Hill's a town of 300. It's a tiny, tiny community, but has this incredible soccer history related to it. So it's fascinating to go into these communities. Now, part of my research, like we were talking at the beginning, I tried to bring it to the present as well. Going into those communities, I did the research for this article in 2022, 2023 to 2024. The United States was a very different country in 2024 than it is in 2026.
Yes.
It truly is amazing. So in the 1920s, in many of these coal mining communities, the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, was incredibly popular. In Gillespie, the KKK had like a business office in the downtown. It is a white supremacist terrorist organization. They would advertise in the local newspaper. They had all kinds of nomenclature, all kinds of words. Fast forward to the 2020s, and the MAGA movement incorporates very, very many of those elements that the KKK did. The KKK, we often think they always covered their faces. They actually didn't. They usually had that pointy hat at the top, but their faces were exposed. They were not like MAGA. They often were not afraid to show their feelings. Now, in the 1920s, the Klan disappears because of corruption, essentially. So, looking in the 2026, I've been to these small communities. They will be flying MAGA flags. They will have things that say "kill all Democrats," for example. So you have this social thing that happened in the 1920s. Fast forward to 2026, in the same belief system, the same intolerance of immigrants, the same intolerance of religion, the same intolerance of women that we saw in the 1920s, that then fades away, is defeated. And the KKK never achieved true political power, whereas MAGA has achieved true political power. And I'm getting a little off topic in that in 2026, in my community in Chicago, the ICE raids that have happened, and seeing my local school, which in 2024, I'd go out for a walk, and after school, there would be children playing. You'd hear 3-4 different languages spoken on the playground. And going out in 2026, and those playgrounds are silent because of fear of the internal police. Again, this is where soccer in the Latino community is massive. And soccer in the Latino community in Chicago There, so many games were canceled because the secret police they're not so secret, ICE, the police force was raiding soccer games because they knew it was important in the Latino community. So you have entire leagues, local leagues, disappearing. So it's just, as an American, telling that going into those communities, reading about the KKK in the 1920s and seeing what they were hoping to achieve, and they didn't, and seeing what MAGA from 2016 on is hoping to achieve, and seeing that they are actually succeeding, that there is resistance to that. And international solidarity, as we're talking, is an essential element of that. And that's why soccer is so great. You can start a conversation about soccer most anywhere in the world.
It's a universal language. The thing is, I wouldn't say that's necessarily off tangent though, Chuck, because with fear and with hatred comes erasure.
Yep.
And with erasure comes the bias of which history they want to erase. And in many cases, what makes our work so difficult when we talk about archiving is that many of these histories will be erased because these hateful people don't want to talk about the fact that the soccer development, especially within Illinois, happened because of immigrants. It happened because people had freedom of movement, and it happened in a way that was progressive, and it involved trade unions. And that's why it's difficult, because people don't want to admit that. So that's why it is important. But like you said as well, you know, the soccer heritage of Illinois and much of the US is one of immigration from different groups of people from all over the world. And to see that now being erased because, you know, 100 years from now, what many people would consider to be the modern day KKK, obviously there still is, but, you know, with ICE, this is the modern representation of those ideals.
Yep.
This erasure is taking place, and it's just incredibly unfortunate, but it's why it's important that these stories are told so that people are educated and so that it doesn't happen again.
And as you say, the success that comes through cooperation of immigrant communities, and then the next generation, which is no longer immigrant communities, but are USA communities, that then a new generation of immigrants comes and takes something to another level. By cooperating, we get a better whole.
Exactly.
So in these coal mining communities, one of the things that is fascinating to me is a town called Dalzell, Illinois. Dalzell, another town of about 400 or 500 people. During the 1930s, they have exceptional soccer through the U.S. Open Cup. They are able to compete against Chicago teams. They're able to defeat Chicago teams. And it's mainly led by a family of 8 Italian immigrants, the Mini family. And they also incorporate one Scottish player. His name's Dave Coots, who started out in Wilsonville, Illinois as a minor, came to Chicago, was a star for Chicago Bricklayers, and in his later years retired to Dalzell, this small mining community, joins this team. And again, high quality soccer, but 90% of those players are Italian. Dalzell becomes fascinating. It's named after a guy named Sam Dalzell, who was a Scottish immigrant who started the coal mine. What then is also fascinating is Spring Valley, which was right next to it. Spring Valley was an early soccer hotbed in the 1880s. Spring Valley was considered the hotbed of American anarchism. People like Lucy Parsons, famous American anarchist, Emma Goldman, famous world famous, would come and speak in that community. So there was a union effort in those communities in the earliest days. But then again, soccer pops up, Dalzell, Illinois, with Italian immigrants, incorporating Americans as well, and gets a successful team. So this cooperation, and why America, the importance of immigrants to constantly make America a better place. And soccer is representative of that.
It is. And one of the places where it is the most is in New York as well. Obviously, you have the Cosmopolitan Soccer League. You know, it's not called that for no reason. It's because literally every single team in the league is representative of a different heritage, which isn't American. It's
right.
It's for Irish people, Greek people, people from Turkey, people from
Caribbean.
Italy, Caribbean, Mexican, people from Africa, anywhere in the world. And when you look at these early years of soccer in America, it is the intersection of immigration,
Yep.
of industry, of
Yep.
cooperation, collectivism, trade unionism, but also of obviously soccer. This is what plays a central role, and really, soccer is the vehicle.
Yep, yeah, and it is unlike American football or baseball. It is able to connect globally and connect to these. I mean, the 1930 World Cup USA team was one of the best teams in the world, without a doubt. And this is where S.A.S.H is so important on this research of getting this out, where the 1930 players came from. And four of those players were Illinois Coalfields. Quality matters too.
Yes.
I guess is the point that I'm trying to make. It's not just that the game was played; it was that these people perfected their craft. And they were respected in their communities as athletes.
Yeah. I mean, building on what we just said, obviously, bearing in mind that what we just mentioned about erasure and hatred and why people don't want to mention certain things. With that in mind, is this the legacy that the pioneering mining footballers of Illinois have left behind? How are they remembered today? Because obviously, S.A.S.H are doing a lot of the work in actually digging these stories up, Chuck, but how much are they actually spoken about out with the soccer nerd community like ourselves?
So realistically, not at all. As I say, I go into these small communities, go to their local historical societies where these local historians are doing the true work of lower league soccer, in a sense. They're doing the work of preserving their community's history. And what you find is often those communities only want to tell a positive story. So a town like Gillespie, which is fascinating, it has an excellent coal mining museum. That coal mining museum, a guy named Dave Tucker runs that museum. It is fantastic. It is incorporates soccer into that coal mine museum. But the story of what the KKK was up to and how popular the KKK was in Gillespie. You would see black baseball teams coming to play the Gillespie team and local baseball team, and just reading the stories with the racist language and the horde. Those kind of stories are trying. People don't want to talk about those, but that is the essential. We learn from that so we don't do it again. And if you try to erase it and pretend that it never happened, you lose the value of history, which is to learn from it. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but from what I've seen is people are looking for positive stories. And it's like, yes, there are positive. There's high quality, but there's also fascinating stories that are not so positive, but we can learn to do better from.
Exactly. I think it says enough though, Chuck, in that the story about them isn't really spoken about. Is that because people are being selective about it? Well, we don't really know, because let's be fair, it's a relatively niche story, the
Yep.
the subject of minor footballers and things like that. And
Yep.
however, if it was discovered, it's the fact that it's not being championed. Whenever we see periods of time like we're in just now, what America is going through just now, we see a lack of research. We see even less intellectualism, and it's something that is a bit of a problem the world over at the moment. But in terms of the legacy of the minor footballers, I think within the conditions that we find ourselves in at the moment, it makes sense that it's not being spoken about. However, it's important that we do because of what we can learn from it. Like you've just said, history is there to be learned from. And I suppose when Brock mentioned the early soccer history of Utah, they have a Utah Soccer Hall of Fame, which absolutely it blew me away to think that Utah has a soccer Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
It's not somewhere that's normally associated with football at all. But I guess if something similar did exist in Illinois, and it might do, are the minor footballers represented in it? Would they be represented in it? What would the selection process be for the stories? And I think this is something that we need to consider given the conversation that we're having today.
No, that's an excellent point. So the Chicago Fire built a soccer specific stadium in the early 2000s, and there was a small section of that was called the Illinois Soccer Museum. And there were no mentions of the smaller towns. It focused really, really only on Chicago. The last time I went to that place, it had been cleared out. And
shame.
I haven't yet been able to find out where that material has gone to, actually. But yeah, that's the importance of archives. Even if you're not using the material in the present, the importance of preserving it for the future, for someone else to discover it, is essential. And hopefully there will be. I mean, sport is huge in the United States. It's massive, and it's a starting point of conversations all the time. And so there should be, and hopefully there will eventually be, a good Illinois soccer museum. I guess is the bottom line, and hopefully, and that's the importance also of encouraging younger historians to get involved. And that's where S.A.S.H, hopefully, with the effort S.A.S.H is making at continuing to recruit younger people, that this is an exciting field, because kids know soccer in a way now that I didn't growing up. It was next to impossible to learn about. Like I say, I learned about the 74 World Cup was the first one. I got it like 2 weeks after the fact, that it had happened. Whereas now, anytime I'm on the public transport here and I look at someone looking at their phone, they're looking at soccer highlights.
Yeah.
It has crossed a Rubicon. It's not a niche. Soccer is a major, major sport in the country. And that's, to me, it's because the U.S. women have been so successful that lifted the whole tide. I guess my point is that there's always more to be discovered, incorporating younger historians and people enthusiastic about sport and steering them towards, the history is actually fascinating. What you can discover from that history that informs today. Soccer is a vehicle for doing that.
Yeah. I mean, obviously today you have Chicago Fire, MLS, but you've also got Springfield FC, Chicago City SC, and I think Peoria City as well.
Yeah, you got Peoria City. There's a whole ecosystem. There was the club that I worked for a while, Chicago House.
Chicago House as well, yeah, of course.
Which is still around. The coach of Chicago House, Shannon Seymour, is not only a fantastic coach, he's 27, 28 years old, young man coaching a lower division team. He was a fantastic player, but he's a great human being. Like he organized Chicago House's recognition of Black History Month in a way that a white historian could not have. Is an inspiration on the field, but an even bigger inspiration off the field. Committed. Another club I want to mention is a team called Edgewater Castle. Chicago, Edgewater is a neighborhood within Chicago. They have been around for 8-10 years, consistently building. They're now moving to USL 2. I don't know if you saw the news recently, Union Berlin with the woman head coach. Edgewater Castle has had a men's, the coach of the men's team is a Turkish immigrant, woman, who started out at Chicago Fire, or Chicago House, actually, Dugu. An amazing person, amazing soccer brain, and now coaching their first men's team. So there's a lot of good things happening in soccer. There's a lot of charlatans too, who see money to be made, and make big, big promises. I mean, you look to our neighbor to the north, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, has a fantastic soccer history and has 5 years ago, they announced they were going to have a team. They were going to build a stadium. Nothing, it disappeared, And so Chicago Fire the Chicago Fire fans are wonderful. They are absolutely the supporters groups that exist, Sector Latino. The supporters have truly built that club, and the supporters groups around the country. MLS, the way they operate their business, I'm no fan of, but the supporter groups of those teams are absolutely fantastic. The Independent Supporters Council, which brings those supporter groups together to raise funds, to help out in communities, is amazing. So there's an ecosystem in the United States, and that's why promotion and relegation ends up being such an important thing. Is a town like Gillespie, Illinois, if they had had the chance, could be a first division team the way Bournemouth is, the way Hoffenheim is. A team like Edgewater Castle, they're playing in a historic stadium from 1910. They're incorporating their local history. They're a local community, but they have aspirations for a national stage.
Yeah.
And by doing things like incorporating soccer minds, regardless of gender, they will get there. So, yeah, there are charlatans, but there's also tons and tons of really, really good people really building the soccer community.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of great stories from across soccer in the US at the moment. That's why I like speaking about it so much. Mentioned Hearts of Pine so much on this show already, and I'm looking forward to seeing those guys play when I'm over in June. And one thing that I was asking, a lot of the clubs that are in Illinois at the moment are centered around Chicago. What impact did the minor footballers actually have on the landscape of soccer for Chicago? Because, these guys laid the foundation for what would become organized leagues. Surely that impact is still felt today, regardless of what thread it follows. Obviously the MLS is a bit of a different case unto itself, but surely the legacy of the minor footballers is still being felt.
I want to believe that, but
okay.
I think there are... So American football in those communities has definitely impacted how soccer is perceived still. And so, but with time and with the fact, that's where the World Cup being in the US, it does filter down to these smaller communities. In Gillespie, like they did a series in about because a couple other 1930 players had connections to Gillespie from the 30 U.S. national team. So every 4 years, there'll be something in the newspaper about that. And these newspapers are still important in these local communities. It may not be nationally, but most local people still get their local newspaper. So it does actually give you an indication of what's going on in that area. So I'm hoping that people will recognize or continue to recognize the depth of soccer in their local communities, because many of these places are incredibly depressed.
Yeah, for sure.
You go into these towns and the only things that exist are dispensaries and casino, are slot machines. Those are the businesses. So it's a sort of complex. That's where Chicago is still thriving on many levels in the way rural towns aren't.
Yeah. And I've always said that where our football history is concerned in Scotland and the UK, we're very privileged that, with the exception of women's football, we're very privileged that we have records of where our clubs have come from.
Yep.
Charting what all their grounds were, where they played, even clubs down to like tiny villages of a few hundred people. And a lot of the clubs today can trace their threads and their histories back to these clubs, how they were influenced in some way by them. And it's just such a shame that, obviously, for different reasons, some good, some bad, that these pioneering footballers in Illinois and the Coalfields, it's almost as if they had their little bubble unto themselves, but that thread hasn't really extended into the modern day. But it is great to see that the soccer scene in Illinois and Chicago is thriving, but sadly without much of their influence.
Right. And I don't mean to be so skeptical of that.
No, of course.
I think that in a sense does create an opportunity, though, because it did exist. And those records, it's like discovering black footballers in Illinois. This town that I'm talking about, Carbon Hill, Illinois, with 300 people, had a very small black community as well. Those black community, the players were incorporated in the soccer team. So there were integrated soccer teams in the coalfields of Illinois at the turn of the 20th century, 40 some years before baseball is integrated. Soccer was actually integrated in the coalfields of Illinois. That's not a well-known story. There are so many opportunities for information to be just, and that's why incorporating younger historians and younger people into that ecosystem is sort of the next level, and recognizing the contributions of the coal mining communities is that next evolution in my mind.
I completely agree with you. I mean, this has been an excellent conversation, Chuck, into this fascinating intersection between industry, migration, and trade unionism, and how soccer played a role in both progressing and developing that, and vice versa. And is there anything else that you want to add just before we finish up? Because we've also spoken about what we see as the future of the game being, and our issues around archiving and how historic memory is remembered in the conditions we have today. It's been such a good conversation, and at the end of the day, this is what I want to bring out in this podcast: is that football and soccer is the vehicle for us to be able to have these conversations, and they're still as relevant in the modern day. Is there anything else you want to add just before we finish up?
No, I just want to thank you for the work that you and your organization are doing to continue to promote and to recognize the game and creating historic records that are accessible. I travel all over the world. Soccer, like I say, opens doors of conversation. Whether someone likes the game or not, people have an opinion and have a view. And that's why soccer is the true international language. And it's important that the stories that are told in that international language are true, and as true as we can make them. And so thank you very, very much for listening and for your questions and doing what you do.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words, but thank you for the work that S.A.S.H, the Society of American Soccer History, do as well, because it's important that we tell these stories to break this illusion and break down these barriers that the US doesn't have a soccer history, because it very much does. It's all very interesting, and even though there's issues with the USL at the moment in terms of player wages and wage structures, there's issues at the moment with how the USL are still kind of technically franchises in MLS and things like that, but we can't take away from the fact that supporters are taking ownership over this. There are some really great stories happening. Obviously, I know that at the time of recording, there's been a huge amount of problems with Hinchliffe Stadium. I get that, but the Cosmos coming back and the ideas behind the Cosmos coming back are something to be celebrated.
Yeah,
you have so many great stories still happening around soccer in the US. So thank you very much for the work that you do as well, Chuck, and thank you very much for joining us in this episode. Lastly, thank you very much to all of our listeners who've tuned in for this. If there's any questions that you have, or if you want to DM us with a suggestion yourself, please do get in touch. You can DM us on any of our social media, or you can also email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. Please also remember to check out our exclusive Patreon feed, where you can get an extra podcast every single week for £3 per month. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.